We kind of overlap each other.
Just fades out.
Yeah, it just have some
Like Alan Rosie.
Okay, we're gonna get started. All right, welcome everybody. If you want, there's more seats up in the front, but feel free to come whenever. We should have more people coming too. So we're gonna get started. So welcome everybody to Kehila, Kedosha, Janina. If you've never been here before, this is the only Greek-Jewish Romaniote synagogue in the Western Hemisphere, founded by Jews from the city of Janina, which is in northwestern Greece. We're an active synagogue, open every Shabbat on Saturday mornings for services. If you haven't been yet, upstairs on our second floor, we have a museum where you're free to take a look around at some of the exhibits about the history of our community. And we host educational programs and cultural events throughout the year through our synagogue and museum, like today's lecture. And so we're really excited to have you all here to hear about this brand new book, The Jews of Edirne. And so please join us throughout the year. If it's your first time, welcome. We're really grateful to have you here. I want to give a shout out to Theo Cantor. If you haven't met him yet, wave your hand, Theo. He's the young man in the back who's our community engagement fellow, who is also has Romanian heritage, and he's helping us launch new programs and events throughout the year to get people reconnected with their roots or grow our community of any background if you're interested in joining us. But today, of course, we're very honored to welcome Professor Jacob Daniels, who's here to present his brand new book, The Jews of Edirne. He's a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and we're really honored because I think this is the first book focused solely on the Jewish community of Edirne. Is that true? So a lot of amazing research has gone into this. Archives in Hebrew, in Ladino, in Turkish, even Greek, I believe, too. Some maybe.
I don't speak Greek. I need to, I'll be.
But touches on it.
Yeah.
Touches with that too.
Yeah.
But an amazing young scholar, and we're so grateful that he made the trip here. And of course is in a space that has such a unique history on the Lower East Side with Romaniote and Sephardic community members dating back over 100 years, including immigrants from the city of Edirne, and some of them are here for their descendants today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Daniels, and we're going to learn about the Jews of Edirne. So
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew, Theo, for making this happen. It was Theo's idea, this whole program. I'm very grateful to be here as a historian. It's really cool to speak in such historic venues. This is like a research trip and a talk at the same time. So thank you for making this happen. Thank you all for coming out. Is anyone here have sort of heritage from the Edirne region? Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So this is also basically the first time I've given a talk outside of academic circles to folks who might even have relatives in the book. So it's a different mode, and I think very often historians who study Ottoman Jews and people who descend from them aren't always interested in the same questions and the same issues. The historians are involved in these inside baseball academic debates, whereas heritage folks just like want to know the name of their relative or something like that. But I think, and I hope we can meet somewhere in the middle today with this talk. My goal is to give an overview of the book in a way that sort of tells the story of this Jewish community in the early 20th century, hitting on some of the main themes of their experience. I hope we'll learn something about borders, about Sephardic Jewish history, and about the end of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of new nation states that came to replace it. So, again, thank you all for your curiosity and for being here. I think, if you don't mind, I'll start by reading the first page and a half of the book. That's, I can't introduce the topic any better than this. The best view of Edirne, Turkey is from Greece. Should you find yourself approaching the border town of Kastanjes on European route E85, scan the checkerboard of brown and green fields to the east. Beyond Greek Kastanjes, chestnut, and Turkish Karac, which means elm, between the Thracian plain in the foreground and the Strangio mountains in the background, a massive 4-minaret mosque looms on a hill over the sleepy borderland, pompously overdressed for the occasion. This is Selimiye, the dominant feature of Edirne's otherwise modest skyline. Upon its completion in 1575, Selimiye was the largest mosque in the Ottoman Empire. By choosing to build his namesake monument in Edirne, the former capital, instead of Istanbul, the contemporary one, Sultan Selim II may have been recognizing Edirne as the empire's second most important city. After all, it was the frequent home of the Sultan's court and the staging ground for military campaigns that had pushed the imperial frontier to the meadows between Budapest and Vienna, 700 miles away. Historians list several factors that could have motivated Selim II to build his mosque in Edirne, but improving the view for people in a foreign country is not one of them. With a population of 180,000, Edirne is now a secondary city, known mostly for its monumental Ottoman architecture and its border checkpoints with two European Union member states, Bulgaria and Greece. Its difficult passage from central city to border town started in the 19th century when the Ottomans began their piecemeal retreat from Europe. By 1908, an official state border existed just north of the city. Over the next 14 years, that border would move back and forth across Edirne, wreaking havoc in the process. When the Ottoman Empire officially dissolved in 1923, the city found itself in a new country called the Republic of Turkey. At that point, the border stopped moving, but the borderland continued to be a place where, quote, the future is always uncertain, as a local Jew had said in 1910. For Edirne residents, the first decades of the 20th century were largely defined by the shifting position and meaning of the state border. Compared to their Muslim and Christian neighbors, the Jews of Edirne, both the city and the larger province, experienced the border in ways that tended to be less bloody but more complex. On the eve of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Edirne Province was home to one of the world's oldest and largest communities of Ladino-speaking Sephardim, that is, Jews who trace their lineage to medieval Spain and Portugal. These people dodged a series of ethnic cleansing campaigns that targeted Muslims and then Christians in the period 1912 to 1922. But in 1934, Jews across the region, which had come to become Eastern Thrace, were attacked by neighbors in a week of violence that prompted a Jewish exodus from the borderland, but killed no Jews. The so-called Thrace events, Thrakia or Ladino, remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. How did Edirne's Jewish community survive the horrors of the last Ottoman decade, only to unravel during the relatively peaceful years of the early Turkish Republic? That is the central question of this book. The answers have much to do with the border, the identities it could and could not generate, the violence it could and could not legitimate, and the survival strategies pursued by local Jews within this tricky matrix. So there we hear some of the main themes of this book. A central place becoming a borderland, the uneven effects that this process had on different ethno-religious groups, and the complicated relationship between Jews and violence in this part of the world. Complicated and sometimes surprising compared to other places where Jewish history was playing out at this time. I need to give credit to my friend Cem Dinlemiş, an artist in Istanbul, Turkey, who made these maps for the book. We kind of talked it over for a while. And the maps, as you'll see, really, in a way, tell you the story that the book goes on to do with words and how the border moved in on the city of Edirne from 1877 to 1923. So, in the beginning of the book, I emphasize that for much of its history, Edirne was an extremely diverse place in the heart of Ottoman Europe. In 1877, the city of Edirne was hundreds of miles from a foreign country, and the province had a Christian majority. So that border you see is just the border of the Ottoman province, and the border with Austria-Hungary, Russia, Greece, all those borders are hundreds of miles away. By 1908, Bulgaria had officially seceded from the Ottoman Empire, and a recognized state border ran just north of the city of Edirne. Still, the province continued to be a place of striking ethno-religious diversity, even by Ottoman standards. It was home to about 620,000 Muslims, 340,000 Orthodox Greeks, 120,000 Bulgarian Christians, 26,000 Armenians, and 24,000 Jews. Also a smaller community of Romani. Intercommunal violence was relatively rare, but daily life was very much structured along ethno-religious lines. For example, the Jews of Edirne, like Jews in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, were governed by the Ottoman authorities, but also local Jewish communal councils and a regional chief rabbi. If a Jew fell sick, he or she would probably be treated by the local Bikur Kolim society. Jewish children attended Talmud Torah schools, or increasingly, schools run by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an international Jewish organization based in Paris. Poor relief and welfare came largely from within the Jewish community. Much of the funding for all these institutions came from the largesse of Jewish merchants and from a tax on kosher foods. The border of the Ottoman Empire at this time was relatively easy to cross through the early 20th century. Edirne Jews continued to visit Bulgaria, a young country that was home to many of their fellow Ladino speakers and family members in some cases. In fact, the train ride from Edirne to Plovdiv, Bulgaria was probably easier than the train ride from Edirne to Ottoman Salonika, today Thessaloniki, Greece. The latter entailed a long stop in Drama, where the Ottoman authorities disinfected the train cars, inspected documents, and recorded the names of all passengers. In Southeast Europe, circa 1908, the boundaries between Ottoman provinces or ethno-religious communities were no less formidable than the borders between states. Bulgaria declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1908. More famously, that was the year of the Young Turk Revolution. After a group of officers and bureaucrats forced the Sultan to restore parliament and reinstate the Ottoman constitution, Edirne's Muslims, Christians, and Jews celebrated the dawn of a new liberal era. Intercommunal unity, iktihad is the Turkish word, became the watchword of the revolution. And new freedoms of the press and association allowed newspapers and clubs to proliferate. What emerged, however, was not a general public sphere so much as several public spheres, plural. Muslims read newspapers printed in Turkish, Orthodox Greeks read newspapers printed in Greek, Bulgarian Christians had newspapers in Bulgarian, Armenians had papers in Armenian, and after 1910, local Jews had a newspaper published in Ladino. So this is a photograph of the Jewish newspaper of Edirne, La Voz de la Verdad, which means the voice of truth, published by a man named Joseph Baristar. Maybe are there other people in this room who can read this? I wonder. Yeah. And this would give so La Voz de la Verdad, and this would give you all sorts of local news from the Jewish community, news from the region, sometimes maybe some news about Jews far and wide, Russia, France, sort of a mix of all those things. It came out twice a week. Most of it was probably dedicated to sort of like local Jewish politics. Yes?
How many pages was this?
Yeah, good question. 6 pages.
6 pages.
Yes.
Adrianople refers to what?
Yeah, also a very good question. I should have said that in the very beginning. That's another word for Edirne. So, it was, Edirne is an ancient city built, named after the Emperor Hadrian. At some point, so I think the Romans called it was Hadrianopolis. The Greeks dropped the H in the Byzantine era and called it Adrianopolis. And then when the Ottoman Turks conquered in the 14th century, they changed it from Adrianopolis to Edirne.
And what do local people call themselves?
Well,
very good question. What do local people call themselves? The Turkish word that we see even in the Ladino press would be Edirneli. So li is like the Turkish adjective for, is the Turkish suffix that makes something an adjective. I mean, like a New Yorker, Edirneli. And it's Turkish, but regularly used even in the Ladino press, like we Edirnelis, etc. Yeah.
Wasn't Adrianople a Byzantine name?
That's right.
Yeah, because Constantinople, Istanbul was Constantinople.
Yeah.
That was Byzantine.
Yeah.
That was the Byzantine name.
Yeah.
it was an important center under Byzantium, Adrian.
Very important center. That it was, and it was sort of the gateway from the capital, Constantinople, to the rest of Europe, and it continued to play that role in the Ottoman period. It's very much, it's the gateway. This is very apropos. When the Ottomans were expanding, Edirne was the city from where the military campaigns launched into Europe. It was the staging ground for victorious campaigns deeper into Europe. When the empire was contracting, by the 19th century, it becomes the fortress, the last bastion, the last stronghold of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. So it's sort of same position, but with very different meanings in the era of expansion and in the era of retreat. So, this, by the way, this isn't just part of the story. This is one of my most important sources. So a lot of the things I've been saying so far, I learned from reading these newspapers. Right? Yes?
Are you Edirne background?
Pardon?
Is your family Edirne background?
No. I'm of Ashkenazi background. I'll confess.
Do you read Ladino in this?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time reading.
Because it's in Rashi, right?
That's right. These letters.
Yeah.
It looks a little. Those of you who can read Hebrew but find this a little funny, not the title, but once we get into the articles, the text itself, it's the Rashi print, which is a little different from what we all know as like regular Hebrew. Yeah, just a little different. So, what we learned from reading these newspapers in this era, this liberal era after the 1908 revolution. Well, we learned a lot of things. One of the sort of juicier stories that I came across. So Edirne Jews were so emboldened by the promises of the revolution and this liberal era that a Jewish protest in 1910 erupted into a shootout between protesters and police in the Jewish quarter. Very unusual to hear about a shootout between Jews and police in the Ottoman Empire. Miraculously, no one was killed. The British consul wrote, both Jews and Turks have terrible aim. But it's also possible, I think, that they maybe were not trying to kill each other. And it may have been a sort of, lots of warning shots. Several Jews were arrested, but all were eventually acquitted. The Edirne incident, as it was dubbed by the Jewish press in Istanbul, became something of a Rorschach test. Some saw in it the government's commitment to the rule of law. After all, the Jews were acquitted. Others saw it as a sign that Jewish political activity in the Ottoman borderland could not exceed certain limits, even in an age of liberty. In terms of political energy and population size, Edirne's Jewish community reached its peak in this period after the 1908 revolution. But by the fall of 1912, this era was coming to a close. Why? The Balkan Wars. In the fall of 1912, the Balkan Wars break out.
Did Jews migrate from Istanbul to Edirne? Why did the population grow?
Why did the population grow? So, the first chapter is an overview of all this economic and population history, but suffice it to say, by the 1600s already, there's a Sephardic Jewish world across Southeast Europe. From Istanbul to Edirne to Plovdiv to Sofia to Thessaloniki, there are thriving Sephardic Jewish communities in all these cities. Yeah. So, Balkan Wars, fall 1912. To make a long story short, a coalition of Balkan nation states led by Bulgaria and Greece, and to an extent Serbia, attack the Ottoman Empire. And again, when you attack the Ottoman Empire from Europe, the first thing you hit is Edirne. And more or less, as you might imagine, things suddenly became awkward for local Bulgarian speakers and Greek speakers. It had not been an issue, more or less, previously, but suddenly Bulgarian and Greek speakers become suspect in the eyes of their Turkish-speaking neighbors when there's a war against Bulgaria and Greece. The arrival of Muslim refugees from the Balkans only reinforced the idea that local Christians no longer had a place in Edirne. But with no enemy state claiming to represent them, local Jews faced fewer questions about their political loyalties. Some of them made strong displays of their Ottoman patriotism. For example, many young men fought in the Ottoman army, and one from Kehila became the first Jewish officer in the Ottoman Empire. Another example is in this photograph, which made it to the cover of the book. It shows two Jewish women volunteering for Edirne's military hospital during the Bulgarian siege of the city. And they're surrounded by presumably Muslim men. They're all wearing these red crescent armbands. This woman here is Angela Giron, and this woman here is Rosa Abigdor. And they would both receive a sort of official letter of recognition from the governor of Edirne Province for their volunteer work. You know, I knew from other. I had this photograph. It was on the only caption said like volunteers at the military hospital during the Balkan Wars. I knew who the two women were from other sources. In fact, Angela Giron kept a journal during the Bulgarian siege of Edirne in French. That is one of the best sources historians have about the affair. So from her journal, I knew that this was her and Rosa Abigdor. I didn't know which was frustrating because I wanted to be the cover of the book. And I guess I said, oh, I'll just have to say one is Angela Giron and one is Rosa Abigdor. And when I was getting permission from the Alliance archive to use this photo for the book, the archivist emailed me back and said, oh, which version do you want, without or with the captions? There's one with captions? Yeah. And he sent me another one, and it has in Ottoman Turkish, which, if you can imagine, it uses the Arabic script.
Yeah.
So the original photo has like 3 rows of Ottoman Turkish with everyone's names, right? Like corresponding to where they're standing. So I was able to count over and figure out that this is Angela Giron and that's Rosa Abigdor. Okay, so in March 1913, the city capitulated and Bulgaria occupied Edirne. You can see Bulgarian flags over here. Some Bulgarian soldiers, or Bulgarian, I don't know, some sort of Bulgarian uniformed man. Local Jews, of course, had little choice but to accept that they now lived in a region called New Bulgaria. Despite her pro-Ottoman sentiments, even Angela Giron, who we just saw, adjusted quickly to the new reality. Her responsibilities as director of the local Alliance Girls' School compelled her to work with Bulgarian Jewish leaders in a wider effort to reorganize the school network and rebuild the region. When Ottoman forces retook the city a few months later, so Edirne becomes Ottoman again, Giron wrote a joyous entry in her journal. But she also noted that the Ottomans could learn a thing or two from the departing Bulgarians. For example, the Slavic occupiers had quickly required all business be done in Bulgarian, while the Ottomans, in contrast, had never forced people to use Ottoman Turkish. The Turks are more tolerant, wrote Giron, but I believe they are wrong, at least regarding language. Their non-Muslim citizens would be more attached to the Ottoman nation if they spoke the language of the Ottomans. So while the Ottomans managed to reclaim the city of Edirne, the Balkan Wars and their aftermath left tremendous scars on the region. The Ottomans lost most of their Balkan territory, hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled that zone, and a similar number of Ottoman Christians were forced out of the Edirne region and western Anatolia. In Edirne Province, the Jewish community was about the only group not subjected to campaigns of ethnic cleansing at this time. Surrounded by a swirl of violence and compelled to adopt a more cautious style of politics, no more shootouts with the police. We might say that the Jews of Edirne were in the eye of the storm. For Muslims and Christians, the border was becoming a sorter of ethno-religious groups, each of which was supposed to have its own state. In contrast, local Jews did not see the border as a limit to their zone of belonging and continued to associate and identify with Ladino speakers across the Balkans, including Bulgaria. What is true today was already true back then. Borders mean different things to different people. Next map. Sadly, the Edirne region would continue to be gripped by violence. So this shows the region in 1915, after first the Ottoman Empire and later Bulgaria joined the Central Powers, that is Germany and Austria-Hungary. So in the bid to get Bulgaria to enter the war on the Ottoman, German, Austrian side, the Ottomans gave a strip of land on the west bank of Maritsa to Bulgaria, and the border even further encroached on Edirne. Now it's really kind of wrapping around the city on almost all sides. So this is the context that the Armenian genocide, which started near the Ottoman border with Russia in the east, reached the Ottoman borderland in Bulgaria in the west. So the Armenian genocide begins near the Ottoman-Russian border, which would be, maybe like in the hallway over there. Throughout Edirne Province, and especially in the port city of Tekirdağ, Armenian citizens of the Ottoman Empire were rounded up, loaded onto cattle cars, and sent to die in the Syrian desert. Contemporary Jewish sources are largely silent on the episode. Presumably, Jews were afraid to write anything that might inflame the Ottoman authorities at this time. World War I was hardly a good period for the Jews of Edirne, as evidenced by the fact that wealthier community members were leaving the borderland in droves, especially for Istanbul. But once again, Edirne Jews did not become victims of ethnic cleansing or mass violence. In fact, they sometimes proved useful in the Ottoman-Bulgarian wartime alliance. For example, the above-mentioned Joseph Bar Yitzhak temporarily left the newspaper business for a job at the Ottoman consulate in Bulgaria, Karaj. Soon he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Sofia. After the Ottomans lost World War I, we all knew that, right? The Edirne region, now called Eastern Thrace, was again occupied by a foreign country. But this time it was Greece, not Bulgaria. The Greek annexation of Thrace became official in the summer of 1910. In nearby Kehila, a local Jew spoke the following words at a public celebration. And I practiced, I was saying Epirus, is it Epirus?
Epirus.
Pardon?
Epirus.
Epirus. From Epirus to Edirne, over 300,000 Jews wildly applauded the victories of his valiant and heroic Greek people. Today in Thrace, the sun shines brighter. Over the entire region flies this blue and white striped flag. The Greek flag, however, would not be the only blue and white banner to appear in Eastern Thrace around this time. Zionism, which had been slow to take hold in Edirne during the late Ottoman period, quickly gained popularity among local Jewish communities, only to vanish from public life when the Greek occupation ended in late 1922. The Greek administration largely approved of Zionism, which was seen as a fellow nationalist movement fighting for secession from the Ottoman Empire. After 1922, it would be hated by the Turkish government for the same reason. Zionist societies appeared in Eastern Thrace as early as 1919, when the region was visited by a representative of the Zionist Federation of the East, based in Istanbul. By 1921, the city of Edirne was home to chapters of Shivat Zion, Tzerei Zion, B'nai Zion, and Benot Zion. So Return to Zion, Youth of Zion, Sons of Zion, Daughters of Zion. When the British Mandate for Palestine was ratified in 1922, 3,000 people filled the great synagogue of Edirne to celebrate. Young members of the Maccabi Sports Club wore their blue and white uniforms, convenient colors that served both, and the Jewish orphanage brass band played the Greek national anthem, followed by a Kehila. However, this was a largely symbolic Zionism that had more to do with local factors and practical considerations than a Jewish state in Palestine or official Zionist ideology. Constant political flux and uncertainty about the future pushed many Edirne Jews toward a version of Zionism that provided a neutral path in treacherous political terrain. In a disputed borderland where the only political certainty seemed to be the presence of a nation-state as opposed to any particular nation-state, Jews employed a vague form of Zionism that was useful less for what it meant than for what it avoided, namely other nationalisms. Right? You want to be loyal and patriotic to the master of the realm, but maybe not excessively so should a new master arrive to the For the Jews of Eastern Thrace, modern nationalism was not an exciting chance to break with the past, so much as a dangerous but obligatory game in which the safest strategy could be a modified version of Zionism that evokes old patterns of communal autonomy from the Ottoman era. To an extent, this strategy paid off when the Greeks, and by the Greeks I mean the military administration and everyday civilians, were ousted from the region by the Turkish national movement in late 1922. When Edirne became part of the new Republic of Turkey, local Jews could plausibly claim that they had not been pro-Greek so much as pro-Jewish. With that said, Zionist activity ceased or was forced underground during the first decade of the Turkish Republic. From 1923 to 1933, the Jews of Edirne experienced pressure to assimilate in the cultural realm and resentment and exclusion in the economic realm. Still, this was a relatively peaceful time compared to the period 1912 to 1922. Here we see Jewish men, presumably Jewish men, because I found it in a Jewish archive, making cheese in the Edirne region. That was a common profession for local Jews. And one of the interesting and ultimately problematic developments of this period, the idea, I think for some local Turkish Muslim leaders, the idea was that the Greeks, who were largely the commercial element in this part of the world. A lot of the stereotypes that, like in other parts of the world, one associates with Jews were more associated with Greeks, Greek Orthodox Christians in this part of the world. And after Greeks and other Christians were expelled, local Muslim leaders were hoping to create what some call like a Muslim bourgeoisie, hoping that like Turkish speakers would replace those roles and take on those businesses. In fact, many Jews ended up sort of filling the space left by the departing Greeks, and that led to frustration and resentment from some Turkish Muslim leaders. I say Muslim, by the way, I'm not trying, it's very tricky, the words we use to talk about this region. It's dicey, no matter what of the Turkish Republic, where we can say there's tension, but no violence, and it sort of remains to be seen how and when Jews will assimilate and truly be accepted as Turks, as Turkish citizens. But in 1934, there's a dark development. So in the summer of 1934, an official from the Turkish government tours the region, writes up a report, and a few days later, in pretty much every single town that he visited and spoke to local notables, violence erupts against the Jews. So there's basically a week of pogrom-like attacks. Jews across the region their shops are looted, their houses are looted, there's physical violence, no murders, no Jews are killed, which I think is noteworthy. It seems to be a clue that there's a lot of economic resentment involved in this. And maybe 1/4 of the Jewish community of Eastern Thrace immediately leaves the region, mostly for Istanbul. And the rest, those who stick it out, start plotting their departure. And the rest of the Jewish population slowly peters out in the following decades. Today, there are no permanent Jewish residents in this region. So, the so-called Thrace events, Trakya or Ladino, remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. It is no coincidence that they occurred in a geographically sensitive border zone. A process that had started around 1912 was completed in 1934. The borderland was now untenable for all large groups of minorities. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. But I think that the part I'm looking forward to most is Q&A. I hope people have questions. Matt, you get the hand first.
Why was Istanbul more friendly to Jews?
Right, great question. That's sort of the crux of the whole thing. It wasn't Turkey it's not that Jews couldn't live in Turkey. It's that Jews, it seems, couldn't live in the borderland. So Istanbul ended up being a better place for Jews around this time because it was not on the border with Greece and Bulgaria. There weren't these heightened fears about like geopolitical sensitivity. One thing in this guy who wrote this report like a few days before the attacks, he had a whole section on how like Jews are spies, they're spying for Bulgaria, they can't be trusted, all this. So that paranoia, let's call it, wasn't as sharp in a place like Istanbul. And I think a secondary reason, from the perspective of local Jews, Edirne had become, as I said in the beginning, a secondary city. It didn't have the best schools. There weren't great. If you wanted to go to medical school or law school, you had to go to Istanbul anyway. It was just less of a cosmopolitan city. It wasn't a cosmopolitan city it had once been. Yeah, and I should add. Sorry, that just reminded me. This government inspector who almost certainly, whispered in people's ears, you have a green light to attack your Jewish neighbors. It's unclear if he was ordered to do that by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the first Prime Minister of Turkey. Probably Atatürk had more of like a long-term, less violent plan to like gradually change the demographics of the region. It seems that he wanted to do it by legal means, some laws were being passed around this time that would give the government the authority to like determine what kind of people can live in certain zones. And probably this guy who he sent in to make the report went a little rogue and got a little ahead of things. But nevertheless, probably Atatürk wanted to change the demographics of that region in the long run, even if he probably didn't order pogroms. Yes?
Did you come across any photographs of the synagogue or other Jewish sites?
Sure, yeah. I don't have it in this presentation. There are some great photographs. You can, if you just Google Great Synagogue Edirne, like even on the Wikipedia page, there's some very nice photographs of the restored synagogue. It was restored, I want to say, 15, 20 years ago? Not so long ago. It was in very bad shape for many years. And the government, for a number of complicated reasons, sort of a PR move, renovated the synagogue. And I've been there a couple times. It's a museum. It's pretty cool. Yeah. Yes?
What inspired your research of this group in this region?
Yeah, that's right. What inspired my research on this region? Well, there's a two-part answer. There's this thing that I was told you're never supposed to admit in academia, which is, there was a gap in the scholarship. No one had done it. You're not supposed, that's a lame, that's a lame answer because your answer is supposed to be that I was just intellectually compelled to do this. Truth be known, I think first I realized that there was this gap in the scholarship. No one had really written about it doing it. And then I realized there's this newspaper, La Rose and La Verdad, which is just a trove of information about the region. And I started exploring that. No one had really used this source in their work. But then the intellectual hook kind of landed for me. This story about borders and what does it mean to live by a border? What does it mean to be a central city and then suddenly be a border town? How do people understand the border? How are people understanding what borders mean when they're a relatively new institution? And I saw a lot of residents, to our own day, we're still trying to figure out like why borders get people so worked up, or some people so worked up, but not all people. That kind of border story then became, I think, like the motivating intellectual question. Yeah.
Thank you. It was interesting. You mentioned about this like tension between the terminology, like Turkish, Muslim, Jewish, and I was thinking about like the current, like more growing current tensions about like Jews now. Some of them don't prefer to say Turkish now. They say Turkish speaking. They're like, we are not Turks. So I was curious if you find any like source. More historically, Edirne, how they were perceiving themselves, because you mentioned about the Zionist movement. Were they seeing Turkish and Jewish, or it was like more complicated? Right.
Well, I mean, again, I think that is one of the central questions, and we see it starting, especially after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. There are different opinions. I mean, the answer is that there are debates. Different Jews have different answers to that. There are some who are saying as early as 1908, like, we are Ottomans. There's a quote in here, whereas Joseph Bar Yitzchak, who published La Voz de la Verdad, he was a little more in the middle. He kind of made fun of those Jews who said, like, we're just Ottomans now. And he made a point of saying, we can be Ottoman and Jewish at the same time. We can be a member of the Pueblo Otomano, the Ottoman people, and the Nación Judía, the Jewish nation, at the same time. I think he probably represented the majority, that's my guess. There's a smaller group who really believed in the promise of assimilation and probably would call themselves, if not Turks, like Ottomans, plain and simple. Probably most Jews would have hesitated to go that far. They would try to strike some sort of balance. But to this day, and so this is very much a legacy of the old Ottoman system, where communities have autonomy, and if you're Armenian or Jewish or Muslim, that very much, it wasn't just like a label. It determined the world that you lived in. It determined, even could determine the religious courts that you went to, the taxes that you paid. And to this day, in Turkey, I've had conversations with people, people who are not at all racist or anti-Semitic or anything, but they'll say, like, they'll be talking about a friend, like a Turkish Jew, and someone will say, oh, is he, he's Jewish? I thought he was Turkish. It's just a way of talking. It's not meant to be negative, but it's just, at some point, the word Turkish replaced the word Muslim. And the old system of Muslim, Jewish, Armenian, Greek, a vestige of that is, to this day, people are like, is he Turkish or Jewish? It's an Ottoman legacy, I think. Yes?
The first map you showed, there was a lot of land where Edirne was not so much of a border.
Yeah.
And my grandmother, who lived there, and the family left a little bit before and after World War II. Her maiden name was Toledo. The story is they came from 1492 to Turkey. And what I'm wondering is, was Edirne historically not a borderland, and it only became a border, as you describe it, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but before that it was, and the way who she married was her mother-in-law, who lived in Plovdiv, came to a wedding in Edirne, and the mother-in-law said, she's a nice person, I want her for my son. So there was a very close relationship, as you say, the train ride. But the story you described, and the family did leave in the early 1920s for, the story I heard was economic reasons, because the Ataturk in the 20s or earlier insisted that there be a Turkish partner in what had been entirely Jewish businesses.
Yes.
So they left for economic reasons, not religious. And my grandmother describes growing up with Muslims and Christians all around and not feeling anti-Semitism.
Right.
So the whole border story that you're describing, when it didn't exist, let's say earlier?
Yeah. In 1877, 1878, there's this Ottoman-Russian war that more or less leads to the creation of what is now Bulgaria. And that is the turning point when the beginnings of a border start to appear near Edirne. But before 1877, Edirne is known as the former capital of the empire. It's about as central as a city can get. It's a very important historic Ottoman city. It doesn't, the borderland, the border town story begins in 1877.
So before that, the Jews were presumably left alone.
Left alone, meaning...
The way you describe an Ottoman society is where everybody was allowed to do their own thing.
Right. Okay, yeah, compared to the modern nation state, Ottoman society was structured in a way in which the ethno-religious communities were given a fair amount of autonomy. Yeah, that's right. And I just looked up in the index, the Toledo family comes up twice in the book.
Oh.
Yes?
I'm her brother.
Yes.
And I remember the story that the Turkish side, the Edirne family couldn't communicate. They would write letters to the relatives and talk to, but they each had to have someone translate because they used different alphabets, Cyrillic on one side.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
So
Is
that's
that true, Barbara? Do you remember that?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
that maybe was a bit later, in like the 20s or 30s.
20s, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So that's very interesting. So, in even the early 1900s, I would bet they would have written those letters in Ladino, the common language.
Mhm.
But by the 1920s, what my guess, that people are in fact assimilating into their respective countries, and on the Bulgarian side, they're speaking, writing, reading Bulgarian.
That's what I remember. I
Yeah.
may be getting some details wrong.
Yeah.
I also want to say that I have a vague memory of being told that there's a huge fire in Edirne, and my ancestors had to go into the river to save themselves.
Wow, that's 1905,
Oh, okay.
the Great Fire. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Wow, yeah, that's an interesting detail. Wow. Yeah, and the Jewish quarter, Jewish and Christian quarter was devastated by a fire in 1905. The 13 synagogues of the Jewish quarter were all burnt down, and in their place, one grand synagogue was built.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes, Mom.
So I saw in your dissertation you mentioned kayades.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like an imposed silence within the Jewish community, so that there are things that they keep from people on the outside. Does this factor into this book, and when and where?
I found the word once. So kayades, again, probably some of you know this word, it's a Ladino word that means silence or keeping a low profile, political quietism, keep your head down, don't make a fuss. And I found it once in La Voz de la Verdad. It's not a commonly used word, but the writer, Joseph Baristock, he's talking about the situation after the revolution, when there's a parliament again. There's a system of representation in parliament that is not too different from like what we have today, where it's geographic, right? Like Edirne gets X amount of representatives and members of parliament. Izmir gets X amount. Istanbul gets X amount, and so on and so forth. They also, there's this added though angle where the Ottomans built in, they kind of designed it in such a way that religious groups would get representatives depending on how large the religious groups were. So there's this added dimension where it's also meant to roughly reflect how many Muslims, Jews, Greeks, and Armenians are in the region as well. It's a little complicated, but Edirne was, there are 20,000 Jews in the city of Edirne, more in the province. It was not quite big enough to get a Jewish member of parliament. So the Edirne Jews, people like Joseph Baristak, expected the Jewish MPs from Izmir and Baghdad and Istanbul and Salonika to like represent the interests of Edirne Jews. Baristak's interpretation of parliament was, okay, Jewish members of parliament, even if they're from Istanbul, should like represent us, and I think this was after this shootout with the police. You know, our members of where are our members, or Jewish members of parliament, like sticking up for us? You know, but others would say that's not like our member of parliament is the Edirne member of parliament. You know, and to those people who sort of made that argument, or people, or maybe he used the word directed at the Jewish members of parliament from other cities, I don't remember, but he says this ridiculous policy of Kayades is, you know, needs to go. Like, come on, obviously, Jewish members of parliament should stand up for Jews anywhere in the empire who are in distress. And so he used Kayades in that sense, directed at people who didn't want to sort of act Jewishly in the political realm. But those people probably respond to him, hey, that's not how it works now. This is a modern constitutional parliamentary system. Like, you know, Jews don't represent Jews. So he used it in that sense. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your research, like what research you did over there, what it was like doing the research over there?
Yeah, great. So the research process, first of all, so I have been to Edirne several times, and I got a few sources there. Someone, a very generous local librarian, brought me into the basement of the public library, the Hall and gave me access to all the boxes of old newspapers. These were the Ottoman script, which was written in Arabic letters, Ataturk switched it to Latin letters in 1928. And so these were all newspapers from after 1928, and that was obviously a very helpful source. But most of the Jewish sources are in Israel. So there's something called the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem, and just as like the Zionist worldview believes that there should be an ingathering of Jewish people to Israel, they also believe that there should be an ingathering of Jewish documents to Israel, and they go around the world and they try to get Jewish communal archives, box them, put them on planes, and bring them to Jerusalem. So a lot of the communal records I got from this archive, from visiting this archive in Jerusalem, and the newspaper, La Voz de la Verdad, is held at the National Library of Israel. They sent me a PDF of paper. Another important source, you saw some of the photos had this caption, Archive of the Alliance Israelite Universelle. So again, this is like, the Alliance is both like a character in the book, but also a source. So this network of schools that ran from Morocco to Iran, Jewish schools, that the headquarters was in Paris. Conveniently for the historian, all these teachers at these schools have to send reports back to Paris like twice a month about what, and in French, and in good handwriting. French documents from like the early 20th century are, as someone whose French is like okay, French documents are often easier to read than English documents because the British had like really bad handwriting. But in France at that time, handwriting was really important, and it was a standardized way to write. So all these reports are kept at the archive and now scanned. So you read, like the woman you saw, Angèle Guéron, and the other woman as well, Rosa Abigori, both were school directors. And you have, like, every other week, like, you know, they break the reports into sections, like, you know, like update on the school, the political situation with the authorities, true to, like, stereotypical gender norms, the men who directed boys' schools tend to talk more about the local politics compared to women, but it appears in both. So that was a very, very important source as well. Yeah. Yes?
How long did it take you to learn Ladino and Ottoman Turkish?
Ladino was not that hard. I mean, my Spanish was okay already coming into it, so it was kind of just a matter of just like learning the script and just wrapping my head around the fact that it's like it's Hebrew letters, but it's like Spanish coming out of my mouth. that wasn't so hard. Turkish I've been working on for some time, but then Ottoman Turkish is a beast. And I still, but Ottoman Turkish is okay. I can't. I have like friends and colleagues who read it like they're like reading the New York Times, and that blows my mind. I'm not very fast with Ottoman Turkish, but that took a while. I did some like summer programs, and French also. Like I went to France to go to these archives, and I can't speak French to save my life, but I can read it. Yeah.
How did you get connected to the artist who did these?
This is a friend. This is an old friend. My wife is Turkish, and Jem and Lugo, my wife, go back pretty far. And we've been hanging out. I think I met Jem on my first trip to Turkey in 2011 or something, and it was cool. I think we sort of talked about maybe one day some sort of collaboration, and so it finally happened.
Is she Turkish or Jewish?
She's Turkish.
Okay. Çok güzel.
All right, let's thank Professor David. We have a brand new book right here, available for $30 from our Synagogue Museum. The best price you can get anywhere else. Amazon is more than that, and you can get it signed from him right now today. But also, as I mentioned, we have programs throughout the year, so please join us. One key thing I'll mention is he kept referring to the Alliance, the Israelite Universelle, the Jewish French School Network. And next Sunday, right here at 2 p.m., we have the current CEO of the Alliance coming to present about that school network and the role it played in Sephardic and Jewish communities across the former Ottoman Empire. So you're all welcome to come back 2 p.m. next Sunday. But thank you again, Professor.